It's not that complicated. Scientists predicted it. The predictions have come true. Any rational person would say, oh, yeah, the scientists got this right. What's actually happened in the world is that powerful forces, mostly the fossil fuel industry, but also other industries that depend on fossil fuels, like the automobile industry, the aluminum industry, have been involved in a campaign to cast doubt on the science, to deliberately confuse us. So I always say, if you're confused, it's not your fault. People have been trying to confuse you, and they've succeeded. And they've succeeded by bombarding us with messages that are either misrepresenting the science or misleading about the solution.
Wait, will John.
Everybody, welcome back. As always having on very interesting guests. Naomi Oreskes, you have quite the background, so we're going to dig into a lot here. But first off, thanks for being here, and just maybe you can throw us a little bit of an idea of who you are and what you're about.
Sure. Well, thank you for having me on the show. So my name's Naomi. I'm a historian of science. And sometimes when I tell people that, they're like, that sounds interesting. So what does that mean? A historian of science studies the development of scientific knowledge, how scientists learn about the natural world, why they believe the things they believe, and also problems in science. How can science sometimes go wrong? What are the pressures on scientists, political, cultural, economic, others? So my background is in the earth and environmental sciences. My first degree is in geology. I worked as an exploration and mining geologist for a while, but my work evolved into being interested in science as an enterprise and also about the role of science in society. Why do we need science? And what do scientists need from us? And especially in the current moment, why is science under attack?
So that's a great one, obviously. Why is science under attack? It's one that I have a hard time understanding, especially because we have, and I'm sure you're familiar with the phrase, just trust the science. And it's a polarizing thing. And on one end, I completely understand. We want to, as a person who's not a scientist, I was a biology major, but I want to trust the science. I want to believe in that. And I know that there are things that are happening, people getting corrupt. There's all sorts of stuff. So could you kind of just get us a good standard point? I think a great place to start would be, why do we live in a world right now where there is this attack on science? What happened where we don't quite trust the narrative of a whole lot of things, not just within science? I mean, you've seen it happen all over the place, but specifically with science, what happened to get us here?
Well, the answer is actually shockingly simple. And it's interesting because most social phenomena are pretty complex, and there's usually multiple reasons for things. And historians kind of revel in complexity and write long books with lots of footnotes, which I confess to having done myself. But actually, there's a kind of simple answer for what's going on right now. And it really has to do with the failures of unregulated capitalism. So science, particularly in the United States, but really in a lot of the world, but I'll focus mostly on the United States because that's where most of my work is done. And that's where the attacks on science have been most aggressive in recent years. For the last 40 years or so, really since about 1980, since Ronald Reagan came to power in the United States and Margaret Thatcher in Britain, and the rise of what's generally referred to as neoliberalism, many people in positions of power and influence have argued that we don't need the market to be regulated. We just need governments to step back, trust the entrepreneurs, the innovators, the job creators, let the market do its magic, and economic prosperity will flourish. Well, there's some virtue to that argument. I'm not advocating for over-regulation. I'm not advocating for government meddling in our private lives. But one of the things we know is the reality of market failure. And by that, economists mean any kind of situation where markets don't do well, where they don't do their magic, or where the magic turns out to be black magic because they produce deadly products that kill people, or because they dump pollution in lakes and rivers, or because they exploit factory workers, they use children. I mean, there's all kinds of ways in which the so-called free market can be oppressive, unfree, and do tremendous damage. And economists have known this for a long time. There's a famous economist named 𝗪𝗪𝗛𝗡 who wrote about this in the 1920s. So it's not like anybody doesn't know that this is potentially a problem, but it's become much, much worse in the last 4 years for two reasons. The first, I've already said, the neoliberal ideology that says just trust markets doesn't address these realities of exploitation of workers, of environmental damage and destruction, and of dangerous or even deadly products being sold to unknowing consumers. And it especially doesn't address the problem of climate change. And that's how I got interested in this issue. So my new book with Eric Conway, The Big Myth, some people have said to me, wow, that's a big departure. You're writing about economics? I'm like, no, I'm not writing about economics. I'm writing about the ideology that stands in the way of us doing something about the climate crisis. But the climate crisis really brought to the fore and center this giant market failure, that we have changed the climate system of the world because of burning fossil fuels, a perfectly legal product. The fossil fuel industry didn't break the law by selling oil, gas, and coal, but they broke the climate system. And now we are suffering the consequences. You've seen huge heat waves in Europe. We've been sweltering here in the Northeast United States. Incredibly valuable real estate has burned in California. Floods in Texas have just killed, we think, maybe 200, including innocent children. So this is a crisis. Now, how does science come into it? Well, how do we know climate change is real? And how do we know that it's burning fossil fuels that causes it? The short answer is science. And climate change is the issue I've studied most closely, but there are many other examples where science has shown the failures of unregulated capitalism. And so the fossil fuel industry and its allies, including many parts of the corporate sector, have began way back in the 1980s, these campaigns to cast doubt on science. And now they have turned to a full-fledged attack on science by the Trump administration.
As I was mentioning before we got on, is that obviously I haven't dug into climate change. And part of the reason for that is because sifting through the disaster of information and the information overload that we have here is impossible. And so I've avoided it, literally. And I don't understand how people are drawing conclusions from it unless they're someone like you. And so can you give us a good understanding of the general narrative that that's being pushed through mainstream for us to have an understanding, and then as you see it yourself, how you're seeing any form of corruption, any form of influence? You mentioned the Trump administration and what role they play. Help set the scene, and then help give us an understanding of what you found through your research and study.
Sure. Well, let me start with just the basic scientific facts, because I do think scientists bear some of the blame here, because a lot of times scientists will say, oh, it's super complicated, you couldn't possibly understand it. And that's ridiculous, because any intelligent person who's willing to listen for the next 3 minutes can understand it. So the basic science is simple. There are a group of gases that are called greenhouse gases, and they're called that because, like being in a greenhouse, they make the planet hot. And the most important of those greenhouse gases is carbon dioxide. It's a common gas. It's in the atmosphere naturally. Plants use it. So by itself, carbon dioxide is not a bad thing. But like many things in life, you can have too much of a good thing. And we now have too much of a good thing because we've put extra carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. How did we do that? We did it by burning fossil fuels. Fossil fuels, and that means oil, gas, and coal, are carbon-based fuel. They come from dead plants and animals. So when you burn them, that carbon mixes with oxygen, creates carbon dioxide. That carbon dioxide goes up into the air where it traps heat and makes the planet hotter. That's the science. That's all you really need to know. So that took, 2 minutes?
𝗪𝗡𝗛𝗪, the elite private membership club for the modern mystic, exploring powerful teachings on spirituality, self-awareness, ancient wisdom, a deep dive into meditation, mindfulness, and transformational practices designed for those ready to lead their own journey. Are you ready to step up?
And scientists have known for a long time, more than 100 years, that was possible, but there were some complications that made them not 100% sure if the planet would really heat up. And the simplest way to understand that is because plants do use CO2, it could be possible that if you put more carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, you just get more plants, and so there'd be no problem. It's also possible that the ocean could absorb the CO2. That actually is a problem because then it changes the chemistry of the atmosphere, and that gets a little complicated, but we can set that aside. So back in the 1950s, when scientists first started talking about this seriously, they talked about it as something that could happen, that they thought probably would happen, but they weren't 100% sure. That was in the 1950s and 60s. By the 1980s, scientists said, oh yeah, this is going to happen. because there was enough evidence that it was actually already starting to happen. And also by the 1980s, scientists built computer models, what are known as GCMs, general circulation models. People often think they stand for general climate models. You could call them that too, it doesn't really matter. But they're models of the circulation of the atmosphere. Those models showed without any doubt whatsoever that if the carbon dioxide reached a certain point, the planet would start to heat up. And that has now happened. So here we are now in 2025. So we're fully 75 years after scientists started talking about this seriously. Scientists have had plenty of time to figure it out. And now we're seeing the impacts all around the globe. And all of this, the floods, the fires, the hurricanes, it's all stuff that scientists predicted would happen. And those predictions have come true. So by any basic standard of scientific knowledge, it's not that complicated. Scientists predicted it. The predictions have come true. Any rational person would say, oh, yeah, the scientists got this right. Now, what are we going to do about it? But what's actually happened in the world is that powerful forces, mostly the fossil fuel industry, but also other industries that depend on fossil fuels, like the automobile industry, the aluminum industry, have been involved since the 1980s in a campaign to cast doubt on the science, to deliberately confuse us. So I always say, if you're confused, it's not your fault. People have been trying to confuse you, and they've succeeded. And they've succeeded by bombarding us with messages that are either misrepresenting the science or misleading about the solution. So Eric Conway and I wrote a book about this. It was published in 2010, so it's been a full 15 years. It's still in print, gone through 2 editions, 11 foreign languages. So this book has proved to be important because it answers the very question that you posed. What am I supposed to do in the face of all this confusion? And so in the book, we lay out what is the science and why do people fight it and how did they fight it? And in our more recent work and some of the ongoing work I've done, we've been looking, for example, at misleading advertisement, where a company like ExxonMobil leads us to believe we can solve the problem with biofuels. Or Shell boasts about how they're now using biofuels at the Indianapolis 500 race course. But if you actually look at their internal documents, you see a very different story where they don't actually have any serious plan to develop biofuels on a large scale. And in fact, technologically, they know it's extremely unlikely. And meanwhile, they're also telling us we can't live without fossil fuels. Fossil fuels are the basis of prosperity. Renewables are too unreliable. Wind power kills bird. All kinds of disinformation meant to make us think either that, or just to say, well, we can't really fix it. We'll have to adapt. So all designed to confuse us, to make us uncertain about the science, to make us think that we have no choice but to keep using fossil fuels, and ultimately to just give up and say, I don't know, it's too complicated, so I'm just going to go to soccer.
I mean, this narrative, though, in the way that they've done, in the way that, as you're proposing, that they've muddied the waters, still troubles me due to the fact that if you're correct, then we're in trouble. And if you're not correct, even if you're not correct, and we are still doing some damage to our environment, and let's say the models potentially got something wrong, we don't know what that leads to either. I don't see it, either one. And so is there, because from what I've heard, let's say just what's seeped into my brain through the ether, is there any chance at all that what we've done to the environment, meaning that all the burning of our fossil fuels and what we've done with these greenhouse gases, is there any chance at all that we are just not having an effect? Earth is too big, that we can handle humans. We've been around before. And after, is there any chance that that's possible?
No, there isn't. And I'll tell you why. Because we've in a sense done that experiment. So if you think about back in the 1950s, I think there were scientists who raised that question. Well, like you say, the Earth's awfully big, the atmosphere is really big. How much effect can a little bit of CO2 have? So those were all real, legitimate scientific questions back in the 1950s. But since then, we have measured the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. We know how much more CO2 there is, and it's about half again as much, so about 50% increase. And the change in the temperature is exactly what the science predicts, right? So this isn't a coincidence, right? And we're seeing all this damage that's taking place. So, just look at the floods that just took place in Texas. This is exactly what the science predicts, because a warmer atmosphere can hold more heat. I mean, it has more heat by definition, and then it can hold more water. That's why you get hot, humid days like we're experiencing here in New York today. So you get more humidity, more moisture in the atmosphere, and that enables the production of these intense rainstorms that lead to these flash flooding like we've just seen in Texas. So the science of this is very clear. And there's one more important point because, I try to be self-skeptical. People accuse me of being an advocate and being biased. But actually, as a person who's trained both as a historian and as an academic generally, self-skepticism is part of what we're trained to do. And so I actually asked that exact same question many years ago. I wrote a paper called Climate Change, How Do We Know We're Not Wrong? And this was the basis of a TED Talk that I gave as well. And so I asked that very question about the models, because I actually did a lot of work on modeling earlier in my career. And I wrote some papers pointing out the limits of models, because like any tool, they have their limits. And so the question I had was, well, how do we know the models aren't wrong? There's a lot of assumptions in the models. And the answer was really two things. First of all, scientists predicted this before anyone ever built a climate model. The predictions go back to the end of the 19th century. And that tells you something important. They're based on basic physics, things that were known to scientists in 1899. So they don't rely on the models. The models allow us to flesh out the details of how the changes may occur, but the basic physics doesn't require modeling. So that's answer number one. And number two, we have a lot of other scientific information that's completely independent of the models. And that's what you want in good science. You don't want an important scientific claim to hinge on just one study or one line of investigation or one methodology. But in fact, and this was what I wrote in this paper, we have all kinds of independent lines of evidence. So we have direct measurement of the temperature, so we know that the planet has heated up. We have direct measurement of the CO2, so we know that the CO2 has increased. And we can measure the isotopic composition of the CO2, and stop me if I'm getting too technical. So we know that the CO2 has come from fossil fuels and not other sources like volcanoes. So all of these things have been proved independently. And then even the temperature records, well, you could say, oh, but the temperature records, they only go back 150 years. They're mostly from Europe. They may not be reliable. People measure them in different ways. All true. But we now have ice core data from Greenland and Antarctica that goes back 1 million years. And that ice core data, we can measure the temperature and the carbon dioxide in little bubbles of atmosphere that are trapped in the ice core. So we now have 1 million years worth of data from Antarctica, from Greenland, that complements the century of data, or century and a half, from temperature measurements. So we have so much data. I mean, this question has been studied almost to death, or maybe literally to death, because people are now dying. The amount of scientific information is colossal. And so this is what I've tried to emphasize in my work, that yes, it's legitimate to ask questions. We should always be asking questions. But what's not legitimate is when the fossil fuel industry pretends that those questions haven't been answered.
Mm-hmm. And so you would basically align what the fossil fuels are doing in a similar sense to what the tobacco and sugar industries did to, say, smoking and, say, our food. And so you would assume that that's basically what they're doing, as long as they can continue to keep public sentiment in the sense that we need fossil fuels, we need this, it's not that bad, guys, just keep going. And do you then assume, I guess the question that I'm kind of curious is, like, if they know that this is bad and they know we're headed, shouldn't they be concerned too? Like, are they not just at the same time shifting to try and get these renewable energies? Like, how, if they know that is bad, you got to be like, you know what I'm saying? There has to be a way.
Great question. So let me first, in a friendly way, let me push back on the word assume. I just came from a deposition yesterday, so I'm like super primed and sensitive about words. So I don't assume anything. This is what research is all about, to ask these questions. And the reason I'm probably talking to you here today is because Merchants of Doubt became a best-selling book, because we didn't assume that. We discovered it. We found it. So when we first started working on climate change denial, we did not know that it had any connection to the tobacco industry. People know that now, so that you could pose that question. And I've even been in places where people who don't know who I am say, oh, it's like the tobacco story. I'm like, yeah, because I was the one that showed that, So I kind of literally wrote the book on that. So when we first started working on climate change now, we discovered that the people that we were investigating, who were sort of leading climate change deniers in the United States, had worked with Philip Morris and R.J. Reynolds Tobacco. And we were able to show that the arguments they were making about climate change were almost identical to the arguments they'd made about tobacco. You could take out the word tobacco and put in climate change. It was like that game Mad Libs. I don't know if you still have that. Yeah.
Yeah.
And so we started digging, and what we showed was there was a direct link. Many of the same people, many of the same advertising companies, many of the same PR companies had helped the fossil fuel industry craft a strategy to challenge the science in the exact same way that they had worked with the tobacco industry. I haven't done as much research on sugar, but some other people have, and there's a similar story there. So this is documented. So then the question is, well, I get this question all the time. Don't these people have children and grandchildren? And of course they do, but I think there's a few answers to that question. So the most obvious one is something we're all aware of, and it's greed. And I hate to focus on that. And in the beginning, I didn't. In the beginning, I really focused on more subtle arguments about ideology. But, greed is a really powerful force, especially in certain quarters of corporate America and elsewhere. These companies are fabulously successful. The tobacco industry is the most successful single industry in the history of mankind. If you had $1 to invest in the year 1900, the most money you could have made was investing that money in tobacco. And I forget the exact numbers, but you would be like a multimillionaire by now. So it was a wildly, wildly profitable company. The executives made huge fortunes, built beautiful homes in Greenwich, Connecticut, or wherever. And they lived a really good life. And they didn't want to give up that good life. So greed is really part of it. And we see a similar thing with the fossil fuel industry, who in recent years, they've had $1 trillion profits while the rest of us are picking up the bill for the damage. So that's one. And then there are two other more subtle arguments. And the more subtle argument that I see a lot in the historical record is rationalization. They come up with an argument to rationalize their position. And the new book, The Big Myth, really goes into this argument a lot. So the rationalization is about freedom. You say something like this: well, yeah, okay, we know that cigarettes probably cause lung cancer. That's what they'll say. In reality, we know they definitely cause lung cancer, but I'm now going to role play this guy. Imagine that I'm a tobacco executive. Yeah, I get it. There's some scientific evidence that smoking could cause cancer, but you got to die of something. And do you really want the government telling you whether or not you can or can't smoke?
Right.
Not crazy, right? But on the other hand, if I'm the smoker, I do want the government to protect me from false advertising, from misleading marketing, and from deadly products that could kill me. And so there is a legitimate argument there about balance between government action versus individual responsibility. It's not a lie, it's not a false argument, but it is a kind of rationalization that enables them to continue to sell a product they know kills people. And then the third thing is sort of the bigger ideological argument, which I've already mentioned, about free markets. So the new book really tracks the history of market fundamentalism and the way it was used to defend corporate practices, some of which were fine, but some of which were not fine, like employing children as young as 2 years old in textile factories. And the argument there is kind of an extension of the rationalization argument, which is to say, but free markets generate prosperity. Capitalism has brought prosperity to billions of people on this planet. And do you really want to mess with that? Again, not entirely false, not a lie, but really downplaying the really true and serious damage that's being done, and also downplaying the fact that there are remedies that can be put in place that don't take away our freedom unnecessarily, don't necessarily derail all of capitalism. So it's a kind of slippery slope argument that exaggerates the risks of government action and minimizes the risks of inaction. And then there's actually a fourth one, which is what Eric and I call techno-fideism, faith in technology. So many of the people in all of those other three camps will also then end the conversation with, and anyway, technological innovation will solve the problem. Again, not exactly a lie, because technological innovation is a real thing, and many technological innovations have made people's lives better. Not all, but many have. But as I've been saying throughout this interview, we've known about climate change, and we've known about it at least a little bit since the 19th century, but we've known about it in a robust way since the 1950s and 60s. So the market, the free market, has had 75 years to solve the problem on its own, and it just ain't happening. And so now we've run out of time. People are being hurt. We can't afford to just sit around and wait for the market to somehow produce the magic technology that will solve this problem. And also because, and then I'll wrap up because I realize this is getting to be a bit of a long answer, some of the changes are irreversible. So right now we're looking at very, very serious changes taking place in Greenland and Antarctica. And you might say, well, I live in Croatia. Why do I have to care about Antarctica? But if big parts of the West Antarctic ice sheet or the Greenland ice sheet start to disintegrate and melt, this can lead to meters, not millimeters, not centimeters, but meters of sea level rise, which will inundate huge areas of the globe and could potentially dislocate hundreds of millions of people. So at the risk of too many shameless plugs for my books, but honestly, that's what I'm here to talk about because my books are kind of my life. In our science fiction novella, that's the premise that Eric Conway and I explore. What would happen socially and politically to the world if 300 million people were displaced from their homes, more or less all at once? Not a pretty picture.
Is that the most likely scenario?
No. We wrote that book as a kind of worst case scenario. Again, it was meant to be a sort of what if scenario. And part of what we try to do in our jobs is be self-skeptical, think about worst, best cases. But what's really scary about that book, which was published in 2014, so 11 years ago, we thought we were writing a worst case scenario. And some of the things we talked about in the book are actually coming true. So the whole West Antarctic thing, back in the aughts and, early 2010s, there was a pretty big scientific argument about how seriously the West Antarctic ice sheet threat really was. I think nearly all the climate scientists I know today would say that it's a pretty serious threat. And what's come out of kind of like, the right lane, so to speak, people weren't talking that much about Greenland 10 or 15 years ago. Now there's a huge conversation taking place about Greenland. And that's really significant for Europe and North America. And this is where, again, I've always emphasized the basic science is pretty simple, but there are like a lot of complications when you go into the weeds. So if big parts of Greenland melt, that just directly raises sea level throughout the globe. But it also has this extra weird effect, which is, it's called a geodetic or an isostatic effect. And I'll try to explain it simply. So rocks and ice have a gravitational effect. Anything with mass, even my teacup, has a gravitational effect. I just don't feel it because it's so tiny. But the Greenland ice sheet is so big that it actually exerts a gravitational pull on the water of the North Atlantic Ocean. So if that ice goes away, if it melts, it not only raises sea level directly, but that gravitational pull is now lost. And so all this water that's being pulled towards Greenland will now be released back into the North Atlantic, increasing the amount of sea level rise in London, in New York, in Boston, all across the northeastern portion of North America and the western portion of Europe.
Wow.
Yeah.
And yeah, I mean, it reminds me, do you remember, what was that movie from forever ago? You've probably been asked about this a million times. The Day
After Tomorrow. I always confuse it with
Day After Tomorrow.
Day After Tomorrow. One was about nuclear holocaust, the other one was about climate holocaust.
Yes. I only saw half the bits and pieces. And of course, I mean, I know obviously they took all sorts of, jumps, in order to try and get anything done. Is there anything within that is even plausible on the slightest degree? I mean, I know they had people walking out of their homes and just like freezing. I feel like, I think that was.
I mean, obviously it was a Hollywood film. It was grossly exaggerated. And the idea that kind of freeze would happen overnight, I don't think I know any scientist who thinks that's plausible. I think what was plausible to me about it was not actually the natural science piece, but the social science piece, right? The idea that people get dislocated. And we're actually seeing that already, right? We're already seeing climate refugees. Many people think the Syrian civil war crisis was caused in part, not completely, but in part by the drought there, the long-term drought that was made worse by climate change. So that piece of it, that climate change isn't just a physical phenomenon, but that it's a social and political and economic phenomenon, and that people may be dislocated, and that significant numbers of people may be dislocated from homes, and that can contribute to political unrest. I think that piece of the movie was actually pretty insightful.
I see. There's an interesting question that I think you could shed some light on for me. Are you familiar? There was just a podcast that was dropped on one of the world's biggest podcasts, which is Diary of a CEO. They had on Eric Weinstein. We've had on Brett Weinstein. I can't remember. I never know if it's Weinstein or Weinstein. Are you familiar with the name Eric Weinstein?
No, who is he?
No. I'm gonna completely botch. As a matter of fact, we'll even look it up right now because he's gonna be one of these people that has all sorts of titles and things like this. I believe he's a physicist, but yes, University of Pennsylvania, Harvard University. He's also a venture capital fund manager. Without putting in podcast host, but if I were to look at his science, he has a PhD in mathematics from Harvard University, and a few other things. Now, the reason I mention him is because in our at the beginning of our conversation, we were discussing, the attack on science and things, and there's a weird thing for sure. I have an interest in archaeology, ancient history, and trying to understand the story of the human race and how we got to be where we are. And I have a lot of friends who are archaeologists and very well known, actually, ones that have come on the podcast as well. And they tell me these stories of wanting to dig into certain areas of science where once you bridge a certain gap or start to ask certain questions, funding dries up. You're told kind of that's not or they get labeled as either quack or this, that, and the other. And so I'm not sure. Where did you do all your studies? Did you do them in the U.S.?
No, my undergraduate degree is from the University of London. Then I worked as a professional geologist in Australia, and then I came back to the United States to do my PhD at Stanford. And I've been in a lot of places. I've traveled a lot, and part of my work is motivated actually by seeing how science can be different in different contexts in different countries.
Okay, well then that's perfect. I mean, the where he was going with this, and it was also tied into, the craziness and everything that's obviously going on right now within the Epstein case, because he was involved with Harvard and funding science and doing anything. I don't know if there was any connections to what he was looking into. It seemed that he was interested in tech and social engineering and in humans and things like that. I don't think I've ever seen anything with him with climate change. But is there seems to be also another wing of people interested in influencing science that aren't necessarily, let's say, the tobacco or industry or any of these big giant commercial industries. Do you think, and it could be pure speculation, or maybe you have some actual experience with this, do you think that there are governments and do they have an interest in either muddying the waters or pushing research? Or, one of the big buzzwords now also is, what is going on with DARPA? What are they doing to the environment? What is this cloud seeding and all that stuff? I think there are valid questions for sure, because we don't understand the science, right? I don't know what they're capable of. And I know that they have way more money than even the tobacco industry does. It's virtually unlimited. So what does that look like to you?
Well, you just give me a great idea for a book. And I actually have sometimes thought about, I have a great colleague in Italy, Massimo Polidoro. He's a science journalist and also a magician, super fun and cool guy. And we've talked about doing a book together, 10 things you need to know about science. And maybe we would talk about cloud seeding or something. So if you have ideas for the things that you would like someone to explain, send me a follow-up email, because maybe this is the idea I've been looking for. So yes, absolutely, governments have interests. And most science in the world today is funded by governments. And most scientists have viewed that as a good thing, because the amount of money available for science increased dramatically in the 20th century, especially in the United States, but also in Europe and Asia, really around the globe. And before that, most science was pretty poorly funded. If you go back to, say, the Enlightenment period, I really don't like that term, but that's what we call it. Because the Enlightenment wasn't all that enlightened, but that's a different episode of the podcast. Anyway, actually, I'd love to have that discussion. Sure. But or the Renaissance, typically science was funded by wealthy individuals, wealthy patrons, families like the Medici, and sometimes that was good, sometimes not so good. Obviously, they would fund what they were interested in, and that's still true today, whether it's corporations, private philanthropy. People fund what they're interested in, and that's a big challenge for science broadly, and not one that will be easily solved tomorrow. But of course, governments fund science. But one thing that's good about government funding is that most of the time it's transparent, because government agencies are required by law, at least the United States, but most European countries have similar laws, to say what they're funding. Now, there are some exceptions, and DARPA is an example because some of its research is classified, and I actually have written about that too. I've had a 40-year career, so I've covered a lot of ground. So, of course, there are always questions, and we should always be able to ask questions about who's funding science and what their motivations are. And scientists need to be transparent. And so I wrote an article some years ago called Why Disclosure Matters, in which I insisted that scientists have got to say who's funding the science, and not just who's funding it, but also who gave them the materials. Because one source of corruption that I've observed in the research I do is when scientists will publish a paper and not disclose that all the materials, all the samples came, for example, from a fossil fuel industry. So this is an actual case that this is public domain, so I can talk about it. I recently looked at a paper that was looking at health effects of the legacy of the BP Horizon oil spill. The version I was looking at, on the top, it said corrected version. So I dug in and found the original version to figure out, well, what did they correct it? And the interesting thing, the corrected version doesn't say what's corrected, so they really should. But so that's another issue. But what was corrected was that the first version of the paper didn't say that all of the samples had been provided by BP. Now, that's a massive conflict of interest, right? Those samples should have been collected independently by the academics who did the work. Or, at minimum, tell the reader that so the reader could judge for themselves whether or not they think that's a problem. So so someone clearly complained because in the corrected version, they say the samples were all provided by BP. Doesn't mean the science is wrong or bad, but it means there's a potential conflict interest that we as citizens have a right to know about. So I would like to see, and this is something that I'm thinking about trying to do more work on, to see journals have much stricter policies about disclosure, about who funded the work, who supplied the samples, who reviewed it prior to publication, because that's another source of corruption when corporate funders get the right to see the paper before it's submitted. So you don't know whether they might have said, would you be willing to just kind of change this wording or this aspect of the design? So we know there's lots of possibilities for corruption, and there's no 100% cure for corruption, but we know that transparency can go a pretty long way in solving at least some of these problems.
TheWayOfWillJohn.com. Exclusive content and programs on manifestation, making money, hidden knowledge. Finally, reach your full potential.
Yeah, and it's so interesting because what we would call, what anybody would generally call corruption may be seen also just as a simple, well, this is how the studies are done and this is how the industry works. I'm BP, I provide you with the sample. You then come back to me, and if I like that, I will say, nah, and then we'll put it out, right? And that is hard. So that makes it hard for obviously just the common person to just say, well, trust the science, right?
Well, exactly, and that's why scientists can't accept that. Scientists have got to hold themselves to a higher standard than that, because we can't expect the public to trust what we do if we don't hold ourselves to high standards of integrity and of transparency.
Sure. Well, I'll let you go. This has been not nearly enough time. You'll definitely have to come back sometime. And we'll definitely. There's plenty to talk about. I will check some other stuff out. Before you go, if you want to tell us, you've obviously written a whole litany of books. And is there an online presence or place where you like to send people specifically?
I probably should do more. My friends have been telling me I have to do a Substack. My webpage shows my books. You can find my books on any reputable vendor or your local bookstop. Or I do like to plug bookshop.org. I don't know if they operate in Europe, but in the United States, if there's a book you want, like let's say you'd like to buy my books, you can go to bookshop.org. You can type in my name, Naomi Oreskes, and then it will show you a local bookstore near you where you can buy the book. And so it helps support local and independent booksellers, which is really crucial in these times. So that's the plug I like to make. Buy my books, but buy any book you want. Just buy it from bookshop.org.
Awesome. We'll link to all of that, guys. So if you're listening to this or if you're watching, it's in the description box. But Naomi, very, very interesting. Would love to do it again and dig into some other stuff. So I'm sure we'll do that sometime. But thanks for taking the time today.
You're very welcome. Thanks for having me on the podcast.
Sure.
Take care.